I think one of the things that all of us have been, well, I won't say all of us, but many of us have been struggling with is this transition from face-to-face classrooms to online classrooms. And we had this, rapid transition mid-semester where we had no notice, we didn't know it was coming, and we rapidly adjusted. And now what we have is we have some time to think about how we would do this right. We have some time to think about how it is that we would make our courses really, really successful in a remote teacher or an online teaching environment. And for me, this was a struggle. I had never taught an online class, or still haven't really taught an online class. I'd done some remote teaching in the second part of this semester, but I'd never done that before, and I didn't know what that was going to be like. And one of the things that I need is tools and support. And what course mapping does is it provides me tools and support for doing this. Course mapping, and this is kind of the most exciting way I think we can describe this, is it's a guided tour for your course that you can follow throughout the term. What this does is it creates a plan, it creates this overview, it creates this overarching structure that we can adhere to guide us through our course. And it should be exciting because when I'm going to teach, I'm excited. I'm thinking about all the things that I'm going to share with my students. And especially the first time that I'm getting ready to teach a course, I have so many things that I want to put into that course, and I don't know where they fit. So what a course map is a puzzle. And I love puzzles. I love intellectual challenges. I love to find a way to make it all fit. And I want to make it fit just right. I want to make it set up so that everything is interconnected. Because one of the things that I know about critical thinking is that in order to create critical thinking opportunities for our students, we have to create connections. Course mapping allows us to proactively think about those connections and to put it all together and to create a plan by which we can share with our students all of the content, driving toward all of our course objectives so that we have a successful semester. And we're going to do this at the beginning. So what we're going to do is we're going to sit down, we're going to put all of this together at the beginning, we're going to create that plan. Now, that is a tentative plan. And we'll talk about some of the challenges in a little bit because sometimes we're not where we thought we would be in week 3. Sometimes week 6 is a little different than we expected week 6 to be. And sometimes when we learn about that information in week 8, because sometimes when we're teaching a class for the first time, we don't know all of the content before the semester starts that we'll be teaching. So sometimes when we get involved in that reading or in doing our research for class, we say, wow, I expected something a little bit different then. Well, then that plan might have to change. But this course map provides a plan of interconnections to allow us to organize the class in a way that is going to be successful for us and successful for our students. So there's a lot of benefits of course mapping.
All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about those benefits and walk us through kind of 4 different areas that I think really work well when it comes to course mapping. The first one is really a focus on coverage and making sure that things like your learning objectives and the different activities and things that you've decided to include in your course, that they map well across an entire term. So sometimes we're used to kind of thinking about our course 1 week at a time. And it doesn't always allow us to think through kind of a broad diversity of activities or even to kind of double check ourselves to make sure that we're covering everything that we want to cover in terms of the learning or the content. The other thing that can happen in terms of coverage is sometimes we have learning objectives that we say in the syllabus, but we're not always assessing them throughout the course. Maybe they kind of fall off after we've taught a course for a little while. So a course map also really ensures that you're getting that coverage of everything being assessed somewhere and you know where that's happening. The next thing that's a real benefit is that it allows you to have constructive alignment. And what that means is that you can really see the connections between things like your learning objectives and your assessments. And you're making sure that there's real links happening there. What's nice about that is when you're communicating with your students in things like assignments or rubrics or classroom activities, you can tell them those direct connections. And it can really help students to understand kind of the rationale behind what you're doing in the course and how it ties specifically to the things that you want them to learn and know as they're going through the course materials. Another benefit is that course mapping can really help with sequencing. So many times when we're working through a course design process, we realize that there's actually a number of different ways that we can sequence the course material, and it would all be fine. Like there's a lot of possibilities there of what that sequencing can look like. So when you're doing course mapping, you get to play a little bit, kind of like what Don was saying about the puzzle pieces. You can move them around. You can think about, well, what if I taught this first or that first? Or what's the order in which I want to communicate certain things to my students? This also allows you to scaffold your learning objectives. You can look at them and say, are there certain things that students really need to know first before they move on to other things in the course? And it allows you to be a little bit more strategic about how you're teaching students the content of your particular course. And then the last piece is really what Don was referring to in his opening remarks about how the course map can offer you a kind of support system. So you can refer to it throughout the course as you're kind of going along. You can tweak it if you need to. It's very modular, so you can kind of move things around as you're learning more about what your students' needs are, what their questions are, maybe if there's gaps in their knowledge that you need to be focusing on a little bit more. But I think that a course map can help you to feel a little bit more comfortable and more ready because you've kind of done all that you can do. You know that there's some changes that might come in the term, but the course map is going to allow you to shift and be nimble with those changes because you have all the pieces kind of laid out and you have a sense of where they might go. Now, this also creates, I think, a better level of confidence if you have a new prep, whether that new prep is new in terms of content, like you're teaching a course for the first time, or new in terms of modality. So if you've never taught online before, this can be a great way to kind of think through the term, make sure you're covering your bases, see if there's anything that you don't feel comfortable with that you want to follow up on before the term begins. So you're really starting to think about the course as a whole rather than week to week. So it's, in some ways, it's a really extended version of the schedule that you would put in your syllabus. You're kind of adding layers into that so that you have more information to work with as you go throughout the term. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Don. He's going to talk a little bit about some of the challenges.
So one of the things that I'll just kind of reiterate that Kate was talking about is teaching can be an anxiety-provoking experience. It can be a stressful experience. And one of the ways that we know in psychology about reducing stress and anxiety is you increase prediction and control to do so. So what the course map does is it allows me to predict and control. The issue there, though, is that it's up to me to control. So what happens is making all of that fit, making that puzzle work might be hard. Because as I said, to help our students with critical thinking, we have to create connections. And deciding how to connect those topics in an order that makes sense so that we have a logic progression may be hard. Um, for any of you who are fans of like old Monty Python kind of skits, one of the things they would sometimes do to transition between skit and skit is they would have someone say, and now for something completely different. And one of the things that I try not to do in my courses is to have that be my transition. So one of the issues that we have to have is when we're thinking about our content and thinking about the interconnections is where will I end here? And then where will I begin here? And then how do I create that bridge? Sometimes this is easy. Sometimes this is harder. When I teach general psychology, and we'll see samples of my course map a little bit later on about my general psychology class, I'm providing an overview of the entire field. And what happens is it might be hard for me to create a transition from, say, brain and behavior to development. It might be easy for me to make that transition. But with course mapping, I have to think about that transition in order for it to be successful, at least in my opinion. So this is one of the challenges, to find out those interlocking pieces. I choose to intellectualize this and say I have the opportunity to find those transitions, the opportunity to make those connections, but this is not always easy. The second thing is that we're often making decisions without knowing what students need because I'm anticipating where they're going to be, say, in week 4. I'm anticipating about what they're going to be learning. I'm anticipating what skills they will have demonstrated at that point. And unfortunately, they may not be where I expect them to be. There may be a case where I just needed longer to teach something more complicated in the class. There may have been wonderful questions that they brought up that allowed me to supplement the information in ways that I didn't expect to. So I'm anticipating, I'm predicting, but I don't actually know. And one of the things this can do is this can actually create some stress a little bit later. And this is why I think some flexibility in our course maps might be important, but it still should be a structure that's going to help us teach. So I don't think that anything should be set in stone, and that we, being flexible as good teachers, we should be flexible to make sure that we're teaching our students in ways that they can learn, in ways that they can learn successfully. So supporting their learning right is more important than adhering to a strict and rigorous course map, in my opinion. So understand that this is a plan, but sometimes plan changes for good reason. And sometimes we're making choices way in advance and we have no idea what we're making choices about. So letting your students know, and I let my students know this on my course maps and my syllabi, my course schedules, that these are tentative plans, and that sometimes what will happen is in your interests, I will change those plans. And then letting them know when those plans change and why they've changed are important. So the course map should never be set in stone. It really should be adjusted when you have to promote your students' learning, because in reality, that's what we're doing.
Can I ask a question? Sorry, right here.
Sure.
So yeah, kind of related to both presenters mentioned that it can change, right? Like the plan can change. And that's kind of one of my biggest fears, I think, not just like fears, like I don't know every time I teach. And if I feel like, oh, I need something to change, I've always like stuck to my initial plan because I always feel like I didn't know how to present it, why I'm changing it, because I feel like I'm going to look like I didn't know what I was doing.
So
And
one of the things about a course map, and this is my opinion, is a course map is a document for me. It's not
Mhm.
necessarily what my students are going to see. It might be something my students see, but the version of the course map that I see might be more detailed. It might have more stuff in there. And then that's the stuff that might be more likely to change. One of the things that I'll often do is I'll give my students an idea of what's going to happen, right? This is the topic we're going to cover, I think. These are the objectives we're going to do, I think. But I might not include all of the activities. Or I might include the activity, but not tell you what that activity actually means, because that's where that adjustment might happen. So I'm a big fan of having things that my students can rely on so that they can predict and control their experience. But I might say you're going to have this peer review assignment in week 4, but not say what that peer review assignment actually is because I might not know what it needs to be in week 4. So I
okay.
think building in that structure for them so that they feel comfortable, but a structure for me kind of in more detail later on that I can adjust without feeling bad about kind of letting my students think that, I'm unprepared or couldn't anticipate. Because I think oftentimes what happens is that the adjustments we make are showing that we are doing the best things we can as teachers, not that we're unprepared or don't care.
Okay, I think thank you. I think I more meant like in the syllabus. Once it's already in the syllabus, like how would you present that? Like if you decide to change something around, like so it doesn't. How
So
do
I
you
would say
kind of?
again in my
Yeah.
syllabus, the point structure in my syllabus, for instance, won't change unless we have a global pandemic that causes me to change that, right? So the point structure is not going to change. I'm going to have this many exams, I'm going to have this many papers, those kinds of things. But what those assignments actually are, or what is covered in those exams, might change.
Okay.
So the structure, the syllabus will maintain intact. It's the specific parts that comprise those elements, in my opinion, are going to be where that flexibility occurs.
Okay.
But sometimes when like this semester, halfway through, I reissued my syllabus. I said, you know what, that plan is different now. I never expected to move to a remote teaching model. So this is what we got. It's new, throw the old one away. This is what we're working with. I try not to do that. But I do make adjustments a lot. It's just more behind the scenes, but the structure that they see remains unfazed.
Okay.
Katie, do you have additional thoughts on that?
Just that I think this is a really good question. And what I often do as well is I think kind of carefully about what I want to share in the syllabus and what I don't, as Don was saying. But I also try to have some like what I call back pocket activities for those weeks where it's like, I don't really have a good amount of energy, or like maybe I'm sick and I need something that I can kind of pull out of my back pocket, and it's not going to be the normal plan of what I had for my students. And I think that that's the other way that you can think about course mapping is you can have some things that are kind of like extra, like if you need to bring in a guest speaker, or you need to, instead of having an activity that's really instructor led, it's more student led because, you're not feeling great that week or whatever it may be. So I think that there's lots of ways to think about this and kind of plan ahead to be flexible. Sometimes it's just building up your kind of Rolodex of activities, and then you're kind of spinning through each week to say, okay, what kind of activity do I want to do here? Do I think would be most helpful for my students? So a lot of what a course map allows you to do is think about things like activities in advance, but you wouldn't necessarily be shifting kind of major assignments or even like readings and things like that. I mean, a lot of that, once it's kind of in the syllabus, it's helpful to keep it stable. But this allows you to kind of go a step beyond that and to think about like week to week, what does the actual class time look like?
And a point that I'll make, and maybe we weren't clear on this, and I think Katie just said it, is a course map and a syllabus are not the same thing, right? So a syllabus, you've got the structure, you've got the policies and those kind of things. The course map is the week to week breakdown of what you're going to be doing, what your students are going to be doing in the class.
So let's dive into some of the course map elements, because I think this might help you to distinguish it between like the schedule that you might put in your syllabus versus the more extended course map that we're talking about here. So we're going to show some examples a little bit later on, but you can envision kind of a grid. And on the rows of that grid are your weeks of each of the weeks in your term. And then across are a set of columns. And the course map elements I'm going to be talking about are across that top columns. So first you would have a column that would be just the topic for that week. Is there kind of a general topic or question that you're having students explore? The second column is going to be your learning objectives. And so we talked about this earlier in the Online Course Design Institute, but these are basically what students need to be able to do to demonstrate their learning. So are there certain kinds of learning objectives that are often phrased with like very specific verbs of what you're hoping they can do that you're really going to be focusing on for that particular week? There's also going to be a column that's really focused on direct instruction. And these are things that are more instructor-led. So they might include things like lecture videos or demonstrations or activities where your students are really following your lead in terms of what's happening within that particular activity. And direct instruction is used quite a bit in like first-year courses when students are just being acculturated to the college experience. Direct instruction can also be really helpful in the beginning of the term when students are kind of easing back into learning new material. And then the next column is what you might shift to for more advanced students or later in the term. And that's when you're thinking about guided inquiry. Now, guided inquiry are activities where students are taking more of the lead on their learning. So this would be kind of active learning activities, if you're familiar with that concept. And this could include things like small group activities, student-led research projects, things like digital scavenger hunts, where students are the ones who are kind of taking the lead. Now, they might have some brief instructions from you, but they're really going to be flexing more of their autonomy and independence on these kinds of guided inquiry projects. You also have a column on your course map that is focused on social presence. And these are the kinds of things we think about really intentionally when it comes to online learning, because social presence in the face-to-face classroom can sometimes happen a little bit by default. Like, for example, you might chat with students before the class starts, or you might hang around after the class ends in the hallway and just kind of touch base with students. You might look them in the eye in the classroom. You might call them by their name in the classroom. All of those things would be kind of very basic elements of building community. Online, we want to create really intentional moments where students are interacting with each other or they're interacting with you. So for example, if you had a discussion board in the very beginning of the class where students were introducing themselves to each other online, that would be a great example of social presence, where you've really built in a very specific instance where they can engage and create that community together. So there's a column about that in the course map, about how you can create that throughout the term. Then you also have a column that is focused on assessment and evaluation. And this would be the points in the term where you're asking students to provide evidence that they've met a particular learning objective, or maybe more than one. So if you have quizzes planned, or if you have exams planned, or papers, or presentations, or anything along those lines, more kind of summative, evaluative moments in the course, you would layer these in. You can also layer in formative assessments. So if you're giving students a midterm kind of feedback option where they can provide feedback to you, that could be included here. If you're doing things like minute papers, which are just kind of short check-ins, or journaling where you're asking students to reflect and share feedback with you in kind of more informal ways, those kinds of things could be included here as well. And then the last column is focused really intentionally on reflection or metacognitive activities. And this is when you're asking students to focus on their own learning, or to really process what it is about the course that's working for them, or maybe not working for them when it comes to their learning. So anything related to journals, sometimes discussion board prompts, or things like assignment wrappers, where you ask students to complete reflective questions as part of an assignment that they're turning in. All of these would be good examples of reflection or metacognitive activities. Now, there's a couple things to remember when it comes to this course map. One is that you could apply to each box whether things are happening asynchronously or synchronously, because some folks I know are using Zoom quite a bit or other kinds of synchronous video methods to engage with students. So you could definitely note that. And then the other thing that's really important about a course map is the goal is not to fill in every single box. It's really just to be able to look at the matrix as a whole and see that you have a mix and you have a range of different pedagogical strategies that you're using across the term. So I know for some of us, we might be kind of completionists and we want every box to be filled. But I want to encourage you to think about, you don't necessarily have to do that. It really is about a diversity of strategies and making sure that you're kind of trying to touch on different things throughout the term. So I'm going to also offer you some guiding questions before we dive into some examples. And these are to help you kind of think through as you're filling out the map to just kind of get you started, get the juices flowing a little bit. So the first one is, should your learning objectives be scaffolded? And that is basically, does some need to come before others? So you might even start in the learning objectives column first and try to put them in the order that makes the most sense of how you're going to be presenting that information to your students. You can also think about, are there certain kinds of assignments, activities, or assessments that are going to work best to help students accomplish a particular learning activity? Or learning objective rather. So you might look at your learning objectives and then skip over to the column that's kind of thinking about assignments, activities, and assessments and start to sprinkle in things that you know would work really well related to those learning objectives. And this could be based on your prior experience teaching a course or just brainstorming things that you think would be a good fit there. Now, remember with your course map, it's all not set in stone. So you can write things in pencil. I've also seen people do these course maps on things like whiteboards with Post-it notes. So you can really like move things around and be really kind of flexible with where things go. So there's lots of ways to do this where you can kind of mix and match and see where things fit best. You can also ask if certain of your learning objectives repeat in multiple weeks. And this is if you have students maybe working on a larger paper assignment where they're doing like multiple drafts of something, lots of revision work. You might have students kind of repeat their learning objectives in weeks like 1, 4, and 8. And that's okay to do that. It's just something to consider based on the structure of your course and the kinds of assignments you're asking your students to do. Okay, a few more questions. One is how you can scaffold assignments to help students to develop skills over time through practice, receiving feedback, and conducting self-assessment. And this is especially for larger assignments that might be broken out into lots of smaller pieces. So like larger projects that happen across the term. Sometimes this involves team-based learning where they're working with other peers in the classroom. This could also include like larger paper assignments or presentation assignments, research-based assignments, where you're really trying to chunk the assignment so that students are focused on specific pieces of it throughout the term. As you're going through the map, you'll want to see if there's any learning objectives that are not measured throughout the course assignments, that you don't see that kind of mix and that coverage that you want to make sure is there, that alignment. And then the other thing is you want to pay attention is to see if there's both instructor-led and student-centered strategies. So do you see that direct instruction and that guided inquiry happening throughout the term? And then the last couple of questions is you want to ask if you're providing students with opportunities for assessing if they're achieving the course's learning objectives. So again, that alignment between the assessments and the learning objectives. And again, that strong sense of social presence. Do you see it happening throughout the course? And this is especially useful, as I was saying earlier, for the online, because you really want to make sure that you're giving students that opportunity to really connect and form that learning community together. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Don and we'll share some examples.
So what we're going to do is we're going to go over both the start of the overall map and the weekly planning map for my general psychology class. And these aren't completely done for the entire course, but you're going to see the beginning, because I think the beginning is where I need the most structure and the most guidance when I'm getting ready to do my course. I want to know what those first few weeks are going to look like in some detail. And I'm thinking about how those first few weeks are going to set up the rest of my class. So we'll start with the overall map.
I must have an old version of the thing. It doesn't seem to have them in there. Hold on one second, everyone.
Sure. So while we're waiting for this, one of the things that I'll as I said before is, especially coming into a class, right in those first week before class, there's so much potential things that we can do. And one of the things that I try to do is I try to think about how it is that I'm going to set norms for my students in those first weeks of class. So how am I going to teach them to do the assignments? They're going to get more complicated as they learn more as we go throughout. How am I going to set the norms for interaction? How am I going to set the ways that they can expect the course to be navigated? So all of these things are going to inform my course map early on so that I can think about what I need to do to set up my course for later. So what we're seeing here is now the overall map for my general psychology class. And as I had mentioned before, this is an overview of the entire field. So what I'm going to do is kind of think about how is it that I take a field that is very, very diverse and very, very broad and has lots of underlying questions and lots of different theories and some disagreement among those theories. How do I share that with my students? So I figured in that first week, I'm going to have a course introduction and I'm going to talk about what psychology is. So I don't know if you can see my cursor or not, but I'm kind of looking in that first kind of upper left box of those topics. So in those topics, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to accomplish two specific objectives. I want my students to interact with course elements in Canvas. So one of the things that I found in this last semester is that while I was not, ready to teach an online class, a lot of my students were not ready to take an online class. So I'm going to build some elements in there right away to help them learn to interact with my course in our course management system of Canvas. Also, I have an objective that my students are going to define psychology and its boundaries as a field. So at the end of that first week, I want to know what psychology is and what it isn't. So for some direct instruction, I'm going to have my students view a welcome video. So they're going to learn a little bit about me and about my background and my thoughts, not only who I am as a professional, but who I am as a person. What they're going to do there is they're going to start to also learn how it is that they can find these videos that I'm sharing with them. I'm going to use modules or pages, or am I using those on the home page of my Canvas site? They're going to know where to go for that. They're also going to view a syllabus overview video. One of the things that I've really started to enjoy this past couple of months is anytime I give something to my students, I give a syllabus, I give an assignment guidelines, I have a video of me walking through them with that. And I point out elements that I want them to take extra attention to. I give them hints, I give them recommendations, I tell them about pitfalls. So they're going to see me talk about the syllabus. They're then going to view a video modeling interaction with the Canvas page. So I'm going to show them how to navigate the Canvas page and where to find information. Then they're going to view a video lecture on the definitions and boundaries of the field of psychology. And all of this can be done asynchronously. There's a synchronous component here too, and that's the highlights and questions with Dawn. What happens here is that each week I'll have a session that they can come to, and I want them to come to, where we're going to share highlights and answer questions about the material. So at that point, it'll be expected that they've interacted with the information, they've done some learning on their own, and they've brought with me questions, and they've indicated the highlights that they see from their learning. So there's going to be an assignment that goes with that. For guided inquiry, this is the stuff that's more student-centered, as Katie had just talked about. The students are going to use Canvas resources to complete a course scavenger hunt. So now that they've seen me model interaction with that course, what they're going to do now is they're going to go in and apply that learning and demonstrate that learning by finding things. Maybe they find the number of points that an assignment is worth, or the due date of an assignment, or the author of an article, or something like that, but they're going to fill out the scavenger hunt. They're then going to use their online textbooks to answer homework questions on psychological schools of thought. So how is the behavioral school of thought different from the humanistic school of thought, different from the cognitive behavioral school of thought, for instance? So they'll have this that they're going to use, and they'll do this on their own. And they'll also participate in a discussion board about psychology being a science. One of the things, and there's maybe scientists from other fields in the room that have their own kind of pet peeves, but pet peeves among psychologists are things like, hey, psychology is not a science. We use the scientific method, so I think we are, and that's something we'll talk about in week 2. So one of the things we'll do is we'll say, hey, what are your preconceptions about this? Why do you think psychology is or isn't a science? And this gives me some baseline information to guide that information in week 2, where we talk about the scientific method. So now I'm scaffolding that conversation. The social presence elements, my students are going to describe themselves using 6-word essays describing themselves on the course discussion board. I'm doing a couple of things here. First of all, I'm thinking about ways that I can interact with my students and learn about them as people, not just as students. But I'm also introducing them to a technique that I use a lot in my classes, which is the 6-word essay. So rather than just letting you talk about something in as many words as you want, I like to have students boil them down to their essence. And 6 words is a great number of words because it typically means I'm not getting your first thoughts. I'm getting your revised thoughts. I'm getting at the essence of the answer you want to give me. And 6-word essays don't create a lot of reading for me on the grading front. So what happens is I'm introducing them in a very low stakes environment, assignments that I'm going to be using later. They're participating on that discussion board, as I already had mentioned, and they're attending and contributing questions in the highlighting cues with Dawn session, as I already mentioned. So now when we're looking at assessment, I have my first day survey to assess motivations for taking the course in preconceptions of psychology. So I'm kind of saying, why are you here? Are you taking it because you think this is a required course? Are you taking it because you're interested in the course? I have the course scavenger hunt that I mentioned. I have the homework worksheet that I mentioned to demonstrate their knowledge of schools of thought and psychology. And then in this last thing, this metacognitive reflection piece that Katie talked about, on that first day survey, they're answering questions about their intrinsic motivation and their extrinsic motivation for taking my class. Intrinsic is they're taking because it's valuable to them. Extrinsic because they want to satisfy some extrinsic reward or satisfy some extrinsic goal. So now I'm getting a sense about what it is that their motivation is. And then this opens up and primes a conversation about motivation, which is deeply entrenched in the field of psychology. And we're going to revisit that a number of times throughout the course. With the self-essays that are defining self for their essential qualities, this is going to provide me some priming for talking about personality and talking about self-concepts. Later on, we get to the personality and social psychological components of the course. And then the science discussion is an amazing primer scaffolding right into the psychological research methods, which is my week 2. So what you're then seeing in week 2, and I won't go into all of the details, but you're seeing in the same sort of way, what I'm doing is I'm laying out what I want them to learn. So you're seeing in that the objectives, I want them to learn about the scientific method, the terms used in psychological research, the distinguishing features of research designs, etc. I want them to do all of those things. And they're ready to do those after that first week because now they know how to access those course materials and they've started to think about psychology as a science. With the direct instruction, I'm putting out more lecture videos. And these are little modules. These are a little easier to see than me talking for 3 hours at a time. These might be 10, 15, 20-minute videos about the scientific method and variables and moving from hypotheses to theories to operational definitions. And you see some other things on there too, ending again with the highlights and cues with Dawn. So we're setting that routine. We're setting that rhythm. I know what to expect. They know what to expect. For the guided inquiry, they're now going to read a short journal article and identify the research features. They're going to apply that learning about independent, dependent variables, research design, spurious variables, those kinds of things in that guided inquiry piece. For the social presence, again, we're going to have a discussion board. And here what I'm introducing is this scary questions thing that I use in my classes. So what is the question you would not want me to ask you? What is the question you'd be afraid to answer? And then we can talk about why those are scary, and I can identify the confusion that they're having and the gaps in their learning. So this is helping them identify where the confusion is, and it's helping me alleviate that confusion. Because peer review is a huge part of the scientific method, my students at this point will peer review each other's research proposal worksheets. And they'll get to meet each other, and I'll get to see them a little bit in doing that. Again, they'll continue to attend and contribute questions in the highlighting cue sessions. They'll have some social presence there. For assessment, I'm going to be looking at that research article worksheet to see if they're identifying the independent variable correctly, the dependent variable correctly. Are they identifying what kind of design it is correctly? In the research proposal worksheet, they're going to assess their ability to apply the content to create psychological research questions that lead to hypotheses that lead to operational definitions. And then the metacognitive reflection this week is that scary questions thing, kind of looking at the self-awareness that they have about the information that they're comfortable with and the information that they're less comfortable with. But what I'm also helping to create the norm for now is if you have confusion and you raise it, I will help you. So I'm letting them know right away that this course is going to be about you identifying confusing and then me supporting your learning from that point. So at this point, my course map is providing a plan for the entire course and the kinds of things we do, not just the specific content I will be teaching. So this is the overall map. So the weekly map, here is again that piece that's probably more for me. I'm dividing this out a little bit differently. So this is sort of my to-do list for each week. So you can see I have the learning objectives from week 1 listed here again. So interacting with the course and defining psychology. You can see the online content, the online module content listed kind of in the middle column there at the top. So I get the welcome syllabus video to do. So it's my to-do list here. I've got to create the Canvas video. I've got to create the psychology of the field video, and I've got to manage the highlights and cues session. The out-of-class activity that I've got to make available for them. I've got the course scavenger hunt. I've got the schools of thought homework questions, and I've got to set up the discussion board about psychology being a science. The synchronous assessments are going to be that informal learning check, them coming in with me, them providing those questions, and us talking about them. And then there's a number of asynchronous assessments like that first day survey, the course scavenger hunt, and the schools of thought homework questions. So right there, I've got all the things that I've got to do for the week. I've got it nicely laid out, nicely organized, to-do list format. I can check them off, and I like to cross them off because I like to make them disappear when they're done. But I can cross them off, get rid of them. I'm on to the next thing. I also now have the opportunity is to write some notes for myself about the things that I want to keep in mind and make sure that I do a good job with that week. And this is in that content space at the bottom. So the big questions, and having taught this course before that students often have, is psychology really a science, and how are these schools of thought really different? So these are things that I can proactively prepare myself for in getting these materials ready and in handling that synchronous session of the highlights and questions, because I'm expecting to handle these questions. What I can do is I can get ahead of these questions, and I can use the chat and the polling features during the highlights and cue sessions to check on their learning and then to resolve their confusion. So now after having done this, I feel good. I feel ready for that week. I have a plan in place, and that reduces that stress and anxiety because I've increased my prediction and control. So this for me isn't just an intellectual exercise. It creates a security blanket that I know that I can prepare my students to learn and support them in their learning. And now is the time that we'll open it up to questions that you have about anything, because our purpose today is to put you in the position to succeed for your students.
So Eleanor and Troy both had some great questions in the chat. Eleanor's feeling that that was a lot of work in that first week, those first 2 weeks. And how can you decide how much work for students to do, how much time they're spending in your course? And then Troy's question is,
yeah,
oh,
thanks.
yeah, go for it.
Yeah, let me expand on this because your answer, I think, was answering a slightly different question than what I meant to ask. How do you figure out how much time they're spending? Not how much time they're spending, but like what are the methods by which you figure out how much time they are actually spending on your course?
One of the things that I do is I ask my students. And one of the things that is probably, it looks like it might be more work than it is because those assignments and those activities and those modules don't have to be that long or that involved. So what happens is, and this is where we kind of had that question in the middle of it is, you know, what is this and what revisions are you making? It might only be a 5-question course scavenger hunt, right? It might only be a 5-minute course interaction video. It might be only one question that you're bringing to those kinds of things. And what I would do is I have a lot of conversation in those reflections about how much time are you spending on these kind of things. I found that students are not great at telling me how much time they do spend on things, but across the entire population of students, I kind of get an idea. There are always going to be some students who tell me it's too much work.
Sure.
Right, and no matter how much work there is, there's some students that are going to tell me that. But I don't have a great way of finding out how much time they actually spend.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I'm worried about here is once you've added this social presence overlay to, you know, help with community building, which I'm all for, can you articulate what other work you've taken out of the course to put in this additional work?
So I'm not sure that it's really a huge amount of additional work, because what's going to happen is that a lot of the time they would normally spend in lectures being titrated because we're spending less time in creating those videos. For me to do a 75-minute classroom discussion, and actually over 2 periods, that's 150 minutes, they're not going to have 150 minutes of video contact with me. They're going to have much less than that. So I might have 50 minutes of video contact getting to those same places, because my course strategies in face-to-face classes is very interactive. It's very discussion focused. So what would happen is I would expect that I'm getting back a lot of time by taking that 150 minutes down to 50 minutes, right? And getting back 100 minutes there. I am expecting that some of these other things, I typically have weekly assignments in my classes. It's a substitution. It's not an addition for some of those kind of things. You're doing the same kinds of things in an online environment versus a face-to-face environment. But the general question I think you're getting is that should we be concerned about overworking our students and ourselves? Yes, we should. And if we get to a position where we are overworking our students or overworking ourselves, then we have to adapt and revise that course map so that we are being fair to ourselves and our students.
Okay.
I would also add in the layer that social presence can happen simultaneously as some of the learning in your classroom. So it's not like one more thing, it's that it's happening. Like if you have students engaging in like breakout sessions in Zoom, for example, during a synchronous class session, that would be social presence, like their ability to kind of interact with each other through the learning environment. So when you, and I think we saw this on Don's course map example, there's areas where he has multiple things in multiple categories, multiple columns, because they count across the columns. It might be an assessment and it's a social presence opportunity, or it might be an assessment and it's a metacognitive opportunity for students. So that's something else to consider, is that are there things you're doing in the classroom that fit across multiple of the columns? And so you're kind of killing more than one bird with one stone.
So to answer Troy's class, this was set up as a 16-week class, not as an 8-week class in my course map. I think changing it to an 8-week class, it would increase the amount of things it increased the amount of information, definitely, that I was getting out to my students, because I'd probably have twice as many learning objectives, on average, and those kind of things happening. And coming back to Ellie's point, I would probably have to think about what is actually manageable in that 8-week class. To be honest, I don't teach 8-week classes very often. So I'm not 100% sure about what a rhythm or workload in an 8-week class would be. I don't know if it's a complete doubling of the time and effort. I don't know if that's actually possible or what to expect. I imagine it is probably technically, but psychologically, I don't know if that's how that works. So I would basically defer to someone else's experience with 8-week classes. But the short answer is mine was set up for 16.
So I'll add a little bit on that, in that technically the guidelines from the university are that it should be double the hours, right? We're talking about contact hours and all of those kinds of things. But it's not just you're squishing 2 weeks together, right, to make it 8 weeks. You do need to think about how all of those things overlap and what would make the most sense. Is your content really needing a discussion specifically about every single topic, or would it make sense to have that discussion board stretch over one of the 8 weeks, kind of tackling all the concepts that you would have covered over 2 weeks, right? You're not necessarily required to have a discussion every week of your 16-week course, right? So what really makes sense for your content? How are you covering your objectives? And yeah, maybe you take out a few things, or you massage the organization so that it's not exactly matching your 16-week course, but it can be tricky.
Yeah, and the reason I asked that question, my challenge is I did a couple of 8-week classes last semester, and my challenge was getting them introduced to the class, because we have a lot of material to cover, and you kind of want to give them, kind of like what we were looking there with Don's course map. That first week was kind of getting them introduced to the class and to the subject matter, and what was going to be happening. But in the case of an 8-week class, you really have to go a lot further than that in the first week, and then trying to finish the class up with a final project. Well, I might take 2 weeks of a 16-week to kind of get them going on that, but can't do that in an 8-week class. And so everything is so condensed. That's been my challenges, is just the pacing of an 8-week class.
And I think, Troy, one of the things that you're pointing out, and this is the takeaway that I'm hearing, is we've got to understand the trajectory of that class. We've got to understand the structure of that class and what we need to do. So what I would do is I would probably think, and this was Katie's advice long ago, like 40 minutes ago, is that we start by identifying the objectives, and then we think about how it makes the most sense within the structure and parameters of that class to get those objectives accomplished. And I think if we're getting our objectives accomplished, then our class was successful, be it 8 week, 16 week, whatever. So I think that has to be the guiding question for everything.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
So Elizabeth, your question about face-to-face being fluid, that is one of the advantages of an online platform, is that asynchronous learning. You're not worried about that the student missed day 1 and day 2 of lecture, because they can more fluidly absorb that when they enter class and then catch up, if you will. So if you were planning a synchronous session, like Don was talking about his questions, and high points, that might be scheduled towards the end of week 1, right? So that those students that dropped or added could be a part of that towards that end of the week.
Yeah, thanks. All of this is super, super helpful. I really appreciate it. And finals week, when I started this course, I was a little bit more hammered than I had initially anticipated. And so I was very late to a couple of the discussion boards that you had set up very cleverly for us. And I'm now really understanding from my students' perspective how that can be frustrating if you, in the hour before they are due, if you are completing your work. And so I'm trying to think a little bit just about the dynamics, because in my classes, at least the lower level classes, the first week is often very, very fluid. And I'm just curious, should I perhaps not have an initial due date of a Wednesday and then a follow-up due date for a Friday? Should I back end everything because people aren't going to be in, they will be moving in and out through the first half of the week?
And I think that's a great point. One of the things that I've always done in my face-to-face classes is make sure that any points that are earned in that first week are easily earned or made up in the second week as well for students who are late earning to the class. So I think those same kind of general principles of understanding, the add drop period and being generally empathetic to our student experiences, those are going to carry through in the online environment as well. So I think the fact that you're considering this issue is probably a really good step, that you're going to come up with a great resolution that's going to work in your class. I think when Troy's talking about, these 8-week classes where, if the student joins in the second week and now they're, 2 weeks behind in a normal 16-week semester, that's going to be a lot harder. So I think kind of thinking about whether or not we're going to be kind in setting up those first 2 things is going to be important. But I think the easy answer to your question, setting those due dates that they're going to be a little easier for student joining late to hit, is probably a good practice.
I also really want to affirm Elizabeth's point about coming into the OCDI from a student perspective and really learning and going, oh, so that's what that's like. That's what they're experiencing, because many of us have not had online courses from a student perspective. It just wasn't part of our educational experience. And so every time you do have that opportunity to say, what do I like about this? What's kind of bothering me about this? Or what do I wish that I would change? Really do take in that experience and try to reflect it back on what you're giving to your students. So I'm really glad that this is giving you an opportunity to think about that too, Elizabeth. That's awesome.
And just to make sure that everybody knows, our deadlines within OCDI are completely fluid. We have those due dates in there, and then I'm removing them, so it's just to give you that feel and that sense of, oh, my due date's coming up, right? And so that you're staying on track, but please know that we are completely flexible with all of that.
I have a quick technical question related to that, Laura, from our earlier discussions in the design. Is there a connection between putting a due date and having it show up in the student task list? Because I
Yes,
think that
there
was
is.
also one of the reasons we did that, was to show you that it could show up in that task list. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so that to-do list, really, there are a lot of students that rely on that to-do list to know what they need to do. And even as instructional designers familiar with modules and everything, we're finding different ways that students interact with the content. So making sure that you've added things to the calendar, or that you're making sure that they have appear on that to-do list to kind of trigger the students of, oh, I need to get this done, I need to pay attention to this. But then also kind of cross-listing the content, because we're finding students who only go to the to-do list, and if you have things in modules that isn't cross-connected, they never read the article that you posted in the module. They just go to the to-do list and do that assignment, right? So they're not seeing the connection. So that's one of the things that we really encourage, that sort of initial orientation to your course, where you're doing a quick video of, this is how I want you to consume the information in my course. Make sure you're going to the module and going through these things progressively so that you're retaining everything. Yes, you have this to-do list, but this isn't the only place to see things. So that's, yeah, we're trying to put those in place so that you can get that student experience. And I was muted while you said, yeah, so no. Yeah, type. We'll look for it. Any other questions as Jamila types her question? Connecting the to-do list with the modules. So Canvas is building more and more stuff that will appear on the to-do list with students, and I'll connect a link to how that works in Canvas. It's not specifically modules, but you can set your modules so that they have to check everything as done as they go through it. So a page doesn't necessarily have a way to appear on the to-do list, but you can have it kind of require that they check it off as done before they can progress to the next module, that kind of thing. So I'll share some links to guides on how to do that.
So one of the comments in the chat was, it seems that online students often prefer smaller numbers of assignments as well. Having had just a very recent experience with remote teaching, I would say that my students actually preferred having more assignments, lower stakes, than having smaller numbers of assignments. And one of the revisions that I made to my classes, I took the big things and I broke them out into smaller component parts, and then had them be much more regular. And a lot of my students said that they like doing smaller assignments every week than having a big thing due in 3 weeks. So I don't know what other people's experiences have been with that, but my experience was they like the smaller, more routine assignments and having more of them.
One thing to keep in mind too about online, and this is particularly true about blended too, is that we often think about the in-person classroom as having in-person activities and then homework. And that's the stuff that's done outside of class. But when you move a class online, you still have activities and homework, or the things that are graded. And I think sometimes in online, we just assume, well, everything shifts to kind of being homework or assignments. And so when students are wanting kind of these smaller, low stakes things, think about the kinds of activities you would have in your in-person class, like a discussion, for example, where you're not grading every single thing that the student is saying. This is just part of their attendance and participation, that they would kind of come to the class and engage in a small group activity or some kind of a small group or large group discussion. So I think that when it comes to online and blended courses, there can be some confusion about that. And what does it mean to shift an activity online that's not necessarily a homework, even though it's being done in the student's home, and it's being done kind of outside of synchronous class time. So that might be something else to consider when you're looking at your course map, is what are the things that you consider to be more learning activities, like what you would do in the in-person classroom, and what are the things where you're actually measuring student learning and you see it as a kind of assessment or evaluation.
And in the chat, people are talking about their own experiences with shorter, lower stakes assignments, being more regular and routine in their classes and having some success with that. One of the ideas that someone put in there is to have a to-do list with 5 items each week for each course. I like that. It's nicely predictable. It's easy to kind of insert different things on that to-do list each week.
Which Anna is it isn't worth arguing about.
I'm sorry, say again?
Hey, Don, this is Sue. I wrote that. It's 5 items per course is way too much. Think of it, 25 items per week. They can't even see all those on their screen. So they would have a weekly to-do list that they can't even see. So I'm thinking that fewer would be better. Thanks.
Okay. So maybe 3 a week, maybe 2 a week, something like that. What I'm taking away from that, or I'm choosing to take away from that, is that some routine, some manageable routine might be something that would give students a structure in which they could succeed. But again, taking the point that you and a couple of others have made today, we need to be very empathetic to that student experience when we're doing this so that they can actually succeed in their classes. So thank you for that clarification.
Any other questions? A couple of
one other thing that I found helpful, I had to pivot in the middle of a semester with my assignments, or in the middle of an 8-week class, and I saw the students struggling with trying to complete assignments. What I ended up doing about halfway through the semester is, instead of having several different assignments, I had one assignment that had different steps or different parts to it. Then it was only one assignment they had to do, even though there were multiple steps within that assignment to accomplish the learning objectives. So I found that helpful, and the students seemed to handle it better.
I like that, Troy. It gives some flexibility. It gives some planability. I do the same thing in some of my classes with missions. They do a mission each week, but the mission is interchangeable, and there are different things that they can do. So finding ways to make this work for our students is really important. I like that, Troy.
So I want to offer a reminder that in the Online Course Design Institute, you can submit your course map for feedback if this is something that you want, if you've never done it before. I know last time we did the live session, several people said, I've never heard of this. Like I've never tried to do this before. So if you want to get some feedback and talk with our instructional designers, our course instructors, Laura and Trina, you're welcome to do that. And that might be also a helpful way to kind of think through this, especially if you're doing it for the first time.
Thank you all so much for being here today. We'll get the recording posted and links to those guides we were talking about, and everything should be in that course mapping page within the module for week 2. So thank you all so much, and please don't hesitate to reach out if you have further questions. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.
Good luck.